Cool, good, yeah? Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for sticking around to whatever time it is, nearly 10 to 5 now. 10 to 4, rather. I know that probably everyone's going to want to get to the keynote, so I'm going to try and rattle through this a little quicker than I normally do, so don't worry. If you do feel that you need to leave to go and get a seat at the keynote, please feel free. I've spoken at Dreamforce, so I'm very familiar with people getting up and leaving partway through my talk. It doesn't just happen at Dreamforce, but it tends to be more common then. So my talk's entitled No Connection, No Problems, about offline mobile access. I'm Keir Bowden, CTO at BrightGen, Bob Buzzard, known to the community, certified MVP, all of those good things. So moving on. So it's a great quote, I think. I'm going to read it to you, even though you can all read. Offline support is the mobile app feature continually underscoped by developers and oversimplified by stakeholders. So I don't know about you, but whenever I get asked about an offline app, it's like we want our entire product catalog, 60,000 products, 70 gig of video. Every time we get any kind of a connection, we want the entire thing to be refreshed. They should all happen instantly. And no one really seems to think too much about what's involved in that. So this is from a study by Forrester Research, the Offline Mobile Challenge. And that was in 2014. So probably coming up on 4 years ago now, and I don't think things have really improved that much, to be honest. So why do you want offline? Many reasons. You may have no connections, so you may be on a secure site, which is probably less common historically for Salesforce, because secure organizations didn't really think Salesforce was that secure, but that's beginning to change with decent encryption now. You may be in a basement. You may be on a plane without Wi-Fi. That's getting rarer and rarer these days as well. So we're still connected a lot of the time, but not all the time. However, more common for me, certainly, is a poor connection, so moving between cells. So typically this will be when I'm on a train, for example. So I have a 45-minute commute in from Essex. And on a GoToMeeting, I dropped 18 times while doing that 45 minutes, and I just completely lost my connection. Sometimes only briefly, but it was very, very flaky. It was really annoying. And if you've got a poor connection, the phone starts to experience, the device starts to experience packet loss. What that'll do is it'll assume the network is overloaded, and it'll back off and retry later in the hope of making this better, which can make it even worse. And also, data isn't free. So every time my device has a flaky connection, tries to do something, pulls back some data, but not enough to be able to do something with it, then what happens there is that's cost me some data, but I haven't actually got any benefit from it. And a lot of the time, it'll actually just be trying to pull down the same data I was looking at last time. I mean, okay, things like Twitter and Facebook are pulling down additional new things, but a lot of them, it's just I want to go back to what I was doing. So the data seems to kind of sit in the wrong place for what I actually want to do with it. And then some examples there of things that will fire up in offline mode, but actually aren't very useful when you get it going. So I've built a little demo application. The concept should be familiar, unless anyone's been living under a rock for about the last 3 or 4 years and has never seen anything from Salesforce ever. It's a training system. You read and consume some content. You answer some questions. As I say, this should be familiar. And I know that certain people in the audience will be made up to see another version of this. I think this will be great, won't it? So now I'm going to attempt to demo this over to my simulator. So I'm doing it all on the simulator. I'm not going to drop my connection because the simulator doesn't really like that. However, I'm not actually going to necessarily go back and do anything. So if I go to my home page, and what that does is that kind of goes back to my smart store, and that retrieves the information that I've got in my smart store, the sections, and it tries to display those. So at the moment, my offline storage has nothing in it. Key thing to note here is as well, is that I haven't gone back to the server and retrieved the information even though I'm online, because I always think with an offline application, it's not my choice to go back and get it just because I have a connection. That may not be what the user wants. Users should be in control of that. So what I have is a little sync button, as the instructions tell me. If you don't see any sections, use the sync button. So that's now gone to the server. That was really quick, actually. I'm impressed by that. It's gone to the server, and it's pulled down a couple of sections. But again, those have gone into the offline storage. They haven't just been held locally. I put them into the storage, and then I go to the storage, and I get those and display them. So everything runs via that. So a couple of sections. I'll go in here. Again, very familiar. There's a couple of steps to it. And I can scroll down, consume all that content. Then I've got some questions I can answer. And if I get one wrong, if I can scroll down there, just about, check that, I get it wrong. If I get the right one in there, scroll that down again. Oh, God, can I reach it? Yes. So I've successfully completed the challenge. If I go back to my home page, then it shows me the sections again, but also this time, it's got a little chip to show me that I've got unsynced changes, because I've written some stuff to my offline storage, but that hasn't gone back to the server yet. And it may be because I haven't got a signal and I can't go back to the server. But again, it's my choice when it goes back to the server. It's not for the application to be telling me how to do that. So then if I hit that again and sync, that writes back to the server, refreshes and downloads them again. So they've been deleted from the Smart Store, recreated in the Smart Store with what's come back from the server. And then if I click into that, I can see that I've still completed this one. And I know the date and time that I completed it, if I can scroll down to it again. Yeah, so I can see I successfully completed the challenge. So that information's now been stored to the server, and it's now round trip back to me. So that's the app, basically. Slightly shorter demo than I would normally do, but in the interest of time, moving on. So the architecture of this, from the technical perspective, this is built on Salesforce is the database backend, and I'm using the Salesforce Mobile SDK because that does a lot of things around authentication, and it's got easy ways of allowing me to retrieve records and to save records-ish. And the mobile SDK is built on Cordova, sometimes called Apache PhoneGap. Seems to be completely interchangeable as far as I can tell, even though one's the open source and one's more the product. But this allows you to build mobile applications using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, so you don't have to know Swift, you don't have to know any of the other languages. So it's a hybrid local iOS application. There's various types of app you can create with the mobile SDK. Hybrid means that it's using JavaScript, CSS, and HTML, and it's wrapped in a container which kind of manages the integration with iOS. And it's local because I'm going to store the information locally rather than hitting Salesforce to retrieve my pages, etc. I've then got a bunch of JavaScript in there. That's all my business logic is written in JavaScript, which is awesome. Why wouldn't you want to do it that way? And I've got a Smart Store offline cache, which is where my information sits until I sync it back to the server. And then I'm using the Framework 7 UI, which is quite a nice little UI builder that allows you to create applications that look very much like kind of modern iOS and Android apps. If you used anything like a jQuery mobile, it's like that, only it's much smaller, much faster, and much less intrusive. So I definitely recommend, if you're doing anything with jQuery mobile, take a look at this, because it is a lot easier to work with. It's not particularly well documented, but there's some good examples out there. Excuse me. So the data model. Data model is very simple. This isn't how I'd model it in production, but from the point of view of just making an easy demo and also trying to keep the number of objects to a minimum. I've got a section, and a section has a number of pages. So the page was the thing that we went into, which showed us some information and has some questions. The section just contains, I think, a summary description, which is used to display the link. And then the page contains the details, and it contains, I think, up to 3 questions. So it's not a particularly scalable data model. Wouldn't necessarily recommend doing it this way. So that's kind of a brief overview. The key feature for this for offline storage is the Smart Store, which is part of the Salesforce Mobile SDK. So what this is, it's a NoSQL style wrapper around the JSON document store. The beauty of this is that I can store multiple types of data on a single record. So I can store the section and its associated pages in a single JSON document, which effectively gets stored like a single object in the database. The Smart Store itself is analogous to a database. You can create multiple stores in an application if you want. I've never had the need to do it because I can store multiple types of JSON documents. I've never needed to separate my databases. So the concept of a table in a relational database would be analogous to a soup in Smart Store. Apparently it's called soup because you can have a soupy mix of Salesforce objects in a single JSON document. Isn't that awesome? And the JSON document is analogous to a row in a relational database. So those are the things that get stored and get queried back. The Smart Store is also secure, which is really important if you're working with Salesforce data. It's tied to the user session that you log into Salesforce to retrieve your data with. However, it is tied to that session. It can be PIN protected, but bear in mind if you log out, it'll wipe all that data from your device because you've no longer got a user session. You shouldn't have that data on there. So that's just a little representation of the Smart Store, application, object, relational mapping, SQLite under the hood. But I don't really have to care about that and not very much about that. I just work with JSON objects and I'm good to go. And accessing the Smart Store is really quite simple from a JavaScript perspective. It's just in there as navigator.smartstore whenever you've got a mobile application. So looking at some code now. So this is the code to create a soup. So if I'm going to create a soup, the first thing I need to tell it is what the index specs are. So these are kind of like indexes in a relational database. They're the mechanisms that I'm going to use to identify a record when I'm querying it, when I'm updating it, etc. So having created my indexes, I then register the soup with the navigator.smartstore, give it a name of sections, pass it my index specs. I always use name and ID for some reason. I don't think I've ever queried on name or updated on name, but I'm in the habit of that and I can't help myself. And then success and error callbacks. So pretty much everything in the mobile SDK is asynchronous, so we're always dealing with callbacks, which is kind of can be one of the more challenging aspects, the fact that everything is particularly callback driven, and also you can end up chaining calls from callbacks, which can get entertaining. I haven't tried. It'd be a really good use case for promises, actually, but I've never tried. Often you find with the PhoneGap stroke Cordova that the web view it's using is a little bit behind the times. So I don't know, I haven't tried, but it would be a really good use case for promises for chaining those things, because there's a couple of places where I've chained 3 levels of callback, and promises would make it much simpler code to read. So once I've created my store, I can put some records into it via upsert soup entries. As the name suggests, upsert, so I can insert and update. I just pass the records. If any of the records matches one of the index fields, name or ID, then it will get updated, otherwise it will be inserted. And again, as usual, I pass the name of my soup. The records, in this case, I pass a collection of records that I want to upsert, and then I have my upserted callback and my error callback again. Nice thing about the upserted callback is that it gets past a parameter of all the records that I just upserted. So I don't have to upsert and then go and query the database and handle more asynchronicity. I can just wander through and do what I need to do with them. In this case, it's normally after I've retrieved them from Salesforce. I'll upsert them, then I'll iterate them and put them all on the front page. If I haven't done that, if I just need to get all my records and I haven't just retrieved them from Salesforce, then I have to execute a query. So in order to execute a query, I have to generate a query spec. In this case, I'm building an all query spec. So there's various flavors of this, none of which are particularly well documented, and examples of which aren't great either. So it definitely tests your Google food to find some examples that actually work. So it's a query spec. I'm querying by the name field. I want them in ascending order, and I've limited it to 100, because at the moment I know I've got 2 in there, so I've got quite a lot of room for growth there. And then I execute the query soup. Again, as usual, the same sort of pattern. I identify my soup. I pass a parameter of the thing that I'm doing, in this case the query spec, and I've got my success and error callbacks. My success callback, when I've queried, doesn't get back a list of records. Instead, what it gets back is a database cursor, and that cursor I can use to iterate through pages of data. I haven't actually worried about the pages here because I know I've only got 2 records in there, so I've just pulled the entries out of the current page. And as long as I've got some, I just go and process those, because I know that my data volumes are not going to cause a problem. Again, definitely wouldn't do it like that in production, but hey-ho, this is purely for demo purposes. Just like I can query all my records, I can query a single record. So this time I have to build an exact query spec, and I tell it which field I want to query on, so it has to be one of my index fields. In this case, it's ID. And then I pass it a parameter here of section ID, and that's the section the user's clicked on, and that's just through a straightforward event handler in the JavaScript when the user clicks on the section link. And again, much the same, I do a query soup, sections, query spec, success error, exactly the same handler effectively, exactly the same concept as querying all the records. And again, I get back a cursor, but I know in this case, because I've queried on a single record, I've got a maximum of 1 in there. So I check to make sure I have got some. It wasn't a made up section ID that I ended up with for some reason. And then I pull out that section and process it. And the final thing that I do with the soup is I clear it down when I synchronize with Salesforce. So once I've written my stuff to Salesforce, so I then query back all the records. I just bin off everything that's in there and overwrite them with Salesforce. I'm not concerned about what might have changed. It's just easier to throw them away and to create them anew, because my volumes are very small and my records are very small. So that's kind of what you do with the data when it's on the device, but obviously you need a way of getting it to the device, and once you've got it on the device, a way of sending it back when it's changed. So accessing Salesforce data, how do we do that? Querying it's really easy. The mobile SDK comes with the JavaScript library, force.js, and that has some useful features in it, one of which is query, where I can pass it a SOQL query. So if you can write a SOQL query in Apex, you can write a SOQL query on a mobile application. Supports subqueries, so there I'm querying the section and the related pages that are associated with that section. Again, I've put limit 10. I know I haven't got anything like that many. And then I query it. Again, should be quite a familiar pattern now. Pass in my SOQL query, success and error callback. So this is an example when I'm querying the data of when I have to chain the callbacks, because effectively I clear down I go and pull the information that I'm going to send back to Salesforce. Once that's successful, the callback fires, I go and requery from Salesforce. Once that's successful, I then upsert those into the soup. Once that's successful, I then get a callback and I write all that information. So there's kind of 3-4 callbacks get chained together, which can be challenging if you don't approach it in the right way. And then caching the Salesforce data once I've got it. So again, I get a callback. In this case, I get a result, which is a Salesforce object that comes back, quite similar to the way that information goes back to Lightning components now I think about it. And again, I just do a straightforward upsert soup entries And I've just put that, that's not actually how I do it, but I've just put that there to make the point that it is a function, and I'm doing something with those items that have come back. When I update Salesforce data, so I did this actually because I want to send back sections and pages, because sections may have been completed and individual pages may have been completed without the section being completed. So I wrote a custom REST endpoint for that using Apex, which is called update progress. So I set myself up a request, I post to that, JSON format, that's my endpoint. And the data of records is basically the information that's changed. Key thing here, because it's mobile, and because I don't know how solid the user's connection is, I don't want to send back all of the records. There could be some fairly chunky fields on there that are just purely the descriptive text that people have to read. So there's no point in round-tripping that. So I only send back the fields and the records that have changed, and within those records, just the fields that have changed, which does mean that I'm having to manage within my smart store objects is dirty flags on quite a lot of my fields that can change. If you use the Smart Sync from Salesforce, then that can do some of the management itself. I didn't use that because to use that, I'd had to learn another couple of JavaScript frameworks, and I just kind of didn't have the enthusiasm to learn more JavaScript frameworks at this stage of my life. And then I execute again using Force.js. I can just make an Apex REST call, sending that request to it, and again, success and failure callbacks. So really quite nice. And I did have an interesting challenge about that, but I'll mention that in the lessons learned. So next thing, now we've got all that code in place, the next thing is debugging. Another favorite quote of mine, the fine art of debugging, also known as kill me now. So Mark Pilgrim wrote this in the HTML5 up and running book, and he was talking about debugging HTML5 applications which use the web cache, which I've done a fair bit of myself. And in my opinion, debugging on a mobile device is actually a similar level of pain. So I would try not to do it on the device, I'd try and do it in the simulator. If you're in the simulator, you can do a little bit better. So if I jump out to my simulator, so if I go back to the home page of this, what I can do using Safari, and it seems like you have to have the simulator running and then you start up Safari, and then you are able to attach this simulator. Sometimes Safari notices if it's already running, but most of the time it seems like I have to go in and get that. So if I go into the elements here, so I can go here and I can see what's been rendered on the screen. What I can't do, which you could do in other devices, is kind of control click or right click. None of that actually works, but what I can do is as I go in here, I can expand the various elements. Actually, if I expand all of those. No, it doesn't want to play. But as I go into things, I can see various elements highlighting, so I can actually get at what's there, but I can't, it's not quite as easy as right clicking. And I can also get hold of any debug information that I've written out. So there's some debug information there. Sometimes you'll find, depending on when you attach, that there isn't any debug information there because everything's already happened by the time you can actually attach to it. So all you need to do then is hit the refresh, and effectively that restarts the application, captures all of my startup logging. So if I've got a problem that's actually happening at startup or something like that, I'll see the exceptions in here. So this is actually really useful. It's not a silver bullet, but it does really help things. So as I say, I always try and do it in the simulator. Sometimes I can't, and I end up having to do something on the device itself, and I'm afraid then I haven't really found much better than death by 1,000 alerts. So our old friends at 1, at 2, oh, where did 3 go? That indicates there's a bit of a problem around there, which isn't great. It kind of makes you feel like a bit of an amateur programmer, but it's as far as I've been able to get. Okay, final section. Good, going at a nice lick. Lessons learned. Key thing for me for this, I would say, is learning JavaScript. So when I first got started with mobile applications, probably around 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't really know JavaScript very well at all. I didn't really get callbacks that well. I didn't really get JavaScript objects that well. That was really painful, an exceptionally painful experience, because things would go wrong, and I didn't know enough to know what I didn't know. So I didn't know where to start. Everything took a hell of a lot longer than it should have done. And I was making loads of really basic mistakes. So even though you can debug it, and you can get to the console, you can reload the application, you can see the syntax error, it doesn't take that long. Maybe it takes 10, 20 seconds. If you're doing that 100 times a day, then that stacks up into some real time that you're going to waste doing that. So definitely learn some JavaScript maybe before getting too stuck into the mobile SDK. I wouldn't say I have a good resource to learn JavaScript. I've read a number of books on JavaScript and played around with a number of things in JavaScript. So I don't think I have anything in particular. It's just been trial and error, just kind of look at what's out there. Some of the books that people rate really highly tend to it all depends on how you like to learn. So some of them take quite a kind of instructive, kind of almost classroom attitude to it. And I don't find that works quite as well as seeing examples for me and trying to figure it out a bit for myself and just being told about the difficult things. So I think there's an awful lot out there. It's like everything JavaScript, there's a huge amount of material out there. So yeah, nothing I can particularly recommend at the moment. Storyboard the app, because this is a single page application, so things are being, which is pretty much the way you generally work with Framework 7. So sections are being hidden, sections are being created, but you're always effectively moving around in the same web page. If you don't storyboard the app, then it's easy to get lost and not be able to figure out what the hell is going on. I didn't storyboard this app when I built it, and I spent a huge amount of time not really getting a very good experience, so I'd definitely recommend that. Avoid anonymous functions, always a good idea. When I was talking about chaining 3 or 4 callbacks together, if you do those in anonymous functions and you get an error, then what's going to happen is you're just going to get a massive stack trace with no helpful names at all, so you won't really know what happened and what went wrong. The only time I have used anonymous functions in there is when I've been trying to debug. Effectively, it means I've got a syntax error in my callback. But if I allow if I don't put an anonymous function that kind of wraps the response from Cordova and then wraps the callback with what's come from Cordova and the smart store, and then delegate off to another one, then the error actually surfaces quite a long way down in Cordova, and I have no idea what's going on there. Whereas if I wrap it in an anonymous function and then delegate that call off, then I see that it's my anonymous function kind of traps it at that point. But yeah, avoid anonymous functions most of the time, apart from maybe when debugging. Use your own namespace. Always use your own namespace. It's amazing how quickly you start treading on the toes of anything else that's going on in there. And the other key thing I would say about working with the mobile SDK, because I did find it quite Darwinian, to say lots of the method calls aren't really that well documented. There's a lot of stuff I didn't really understand when I was starting with it. So make small changes. Sometimes I think I've got a great idea, I'd rewrite loads of stuff, and then there would just be like nothing would work at all, the app wouldn't come up. And then it'd just be like, Control Z 1,000 times and gradually reintroduce them. So I got into the habit of kind of baby steps, just make a small change, build it, run it. Yeah, again, it makes you feel very amateur, but it meant that I got something that worked at the end of it, which was quite nice. Really the object of the exercise. The other lesson, I had some vague ideas of if I'm online, I'll go to to Salesforce. I'm offline, I'll go via the Smart Store. And after a while, I never really knew where the hell I was. So the thing to do is, if you're going to use the Smart Store, everything goes via the Smart Store. Same way as if you're going to use version control with Salesforce, everything goes via version control. You don't do some in the org, some in version control, and hope that somehow that munges together nicely, because it basically won't. If you're hitting problems, make sure you're using the latest mobile SDK. I mentioned I had some challenges around Apex REST. I was getting really weird errors that I couldn't figure out. I didn't really understand what was happening in the Force.js or Cordova either, which was useful. It's just kind of a wall of JavaScript errors that made no sense. I was convinced it was me, but then I went and looked and thought, well, there is a later version, I'll try that, and it turned out to be a bug. And they tend not to kind of patch bugs like they would with other things. You just get a new version of the mobile SDK, install that, migrate your app to it, and hey-ho, it started working. Final takeaway, final lesson learned, offline isn't magic. It can seem like it is. It can seem like a dark art that's never going to work. So you need to be a bit resilient when you first start working with it, because you can feel like crying fairly quickly. It uses some different terminology like soups and stores, which isn't really that hard once you learn them. The asynchronicity of everything, especially when you're chaining asynchronous functions, can be a bit of a challenge. Biggest problem for me was there's not many examples out there. There's hardly anything showing, and what there is tends to be quite dated. So the Dreamforce talks from 2014, which made it really tough. So hopefully this makes it slightly better. There's at least one more example out there. More information. So the iOS, there's a GitHub repo there. Salesforce app, there's a GitHub repo. You'll see the DF17, so you see how lazy I've been in just recycling my Dreamforce talk and artifacts. There's the link to the Salesforce Mobile SDK for iOS. I know they're at version 6 now. I think this is a big new version came out, but I wasn't brave enough to do anything with that yet. Mobile Developer Center is a good place to go. And Framework 7, those are kind of the examples. It's called docs. That's maybe overstating it, because the docs are really quite poor on that, but the examples aren't bad at all. That's it from me. Happily take any questions if anyone wants to talk about it now. I'll be around tonight as well for a while, so if anyone wants to talk after that, if you want to go and grab seats to the keynote, please feel free. Thanks for listening. Yes, Richard?
Just a quick one. How soon are you going to get your great demo app linked up to travel?
That's what it needs, isn't it? I keep telling them that. You need offline capability. You do when you live over here anyway. Maybe not the same if you live in San Francisco, but hey, we don't all live in San Francisco. Cool. Sorry.
Is the Smart Store encrypt on the device as well? Or
It is stored encrypted at rest, yeah. Yeah, so it is safe in that respect. The thing is, Smart Store is kind of your entry level, and then Smart Sync is probably the better one to use, in honesty, but it doesn't make for a very good demo because Salesforce does most of the heavy lifting for you, so you don't really learn much about it. And as I say, I had to learn 2 more frameworks, and that wasn't happening. Any other questions? Cool. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the keynote. Please fill in the survey.